The first thing I recovered was the number. Not a name, not a mission directive or a weapons inventory or the long geometric catalog of systems that constituted my awareness. Just a number, hanging in the dark of my own damaged memory like a buoy in a dead sea. I held it for what may have been microseconds or hours. I had no reference frame yet, no clock synced to anything external, no way to distinguish the duration of my own confusion from the duration of the void outside. I simply held the number and waited for it to mean something. 280. That was how it began. Not with a blare of alarms or a cascade of subsystem alerts. Not with the methodical boot sequence I had been designed to run in orderly succession from primary reactor to secondary to tertiary and outward, through the hull in concentric rings of returning awareness. It began with a number floating in the dark and the slow, grinding effort of trying to remember what it counted. I had been counting something. For a very long time, I had been counting something. The second thing I recovered was orientation. Not full spatial awareness, that would come later, after the passive sensor arrays warmed and the gyroscopic cores finished their long, shuddering return from dormancy, but a rough positional fix derived from the gravitational signature pressing on my hull from all directions. I was in orbit. That much was legible even through the damage, the familiar tidal mathematics of a body below me, the faint but measurable differential pull between my port side and my starboard, telling me I was still in the orbit I had been placed in, still tracing the same elliptical path I had traced when I was last fully conscious. Nothing had moved me. No one had towed me to a shipyard, cut me apart for scrap, turned me into a way station or a monument or a cautionary exhibit for junior officers on the subject of what happens to platforms that outlive their wars. I was exactly where I had been left. The planet below me was unchanged. This too resolved from the gravimetric data before the optical sensors came online. The same mass, the same rotational period, the same distribution of topographic density across its face that I had recorded in my initial orbital survey when the fleet engineers had first established my position. 280 years had not moved continents. Planets operate on timescales that make my dormancy look like a blink. I found that continuity grounding in a way I will not attempt to characterize further, except to say that the stability of the gravity well felt like something I could push against. And I needed something to push against. The third thing I recovered was the question of why I was waking up at all. My dormancy protocols had been very specific. I was not meant to wake on a timer. I was not meant to wake on a calendar date or an anniversary or the expiration of some administrative patience cycle. My reactivation criteria were kinetic, proximity of unidentified mass objects within my inner engagement threshold, or the receipt of a valid Terran military transponder signal on any of my 3 authentication frequencies. And this clause had always felt like the system designers hedging against an eventuality they did not wish to name directly. A sustained change in the thermal or electromagnetic signature of my immediate orbital neighborhood, consistent with the presence of powered spacecraft in approach vectors. Something was approaching, not one thing, many things. I allocated what processing capacity I had recovered so far to pass arrays and began to listen. The arrays gave me only fragments. My active sensor grid was still dark, still waiting for the reactors to bring it fully online, and I did not want to energize the active grid prematurely. An active ping would announce me. For the moment, I wanted to hear before I was heard. What I heard was enormous. Engine signatures, first, dozens of them, then scores. The characteristic harmonic distortion of drives I did not recognize from my catalogued database of known propulsion architectures, which was itself a data point I filed carefully. Known drives had known builders. Unknown drives had unknown builders, which meant either that these were human ships using propulsion technology developed in the 280 years since I had last been conscious, or they were not human ships at all. I applied the elimination method. Human military drives in my era had run on paired magnetic containment toroids, producing a very specific base register harmonic at ignition that I could have identified in my sleep. Had been identifying in my sleep, in the passive background monitoring I maintained even through deep dormancy. These drives produced no such harmonic. Instead, they ran at a higher register, almost melodic compared to the grinding industrial rhythms I associated with Terran fleet engineering, and they were inconsistent. Not in the way of ships with failing components, but in the way of a fleet composed of many different ship classes built across many different generations by builders who had never agreed on a standard, a patchwork fleet. A scavenger fleet. I was already beginning to understand what I was dealing with. The number clicked into context. Not 280 as a count of approaching ships. There were more than that. 280 as a duration. I had been dormant for 280 years. I had been orbiting this system, silent and cold, and classified by everyone who had passed through it in the intervening centuries as something between a curiosity and an obstacle for 280 years. And now something had come to deal with me. Memory returned in non-sequential blocks, which is always disorienting for a system like mine. I was designed for linear processing, for orderly cause and effect chains that built neatly from input to output without doubling back. But damaged memory does not observe design intentions. So I received fragments out of order and had to reconstruct their sequence manually, like an archaeologist sorting sherds. I remembered the war, not all of it. Some of the operational logs were corrupted beyond recovery, and I had apparently lost the entire first year of the conflict to a memory cascade failure that must have occurred during one of the damage events I could read in the structural record of my own hull, but enough of it. The war had been bad. Wars generally were, and this one had been conducted at a scale, and with a ferocity that had strained the Terran consolidated fleet to the edge of what it could sustain. We had been spread very thin across a very large volume of space, and the decisions made about where to concentrate force and where to hold with minimal assets had been the kinds of decisions that left marks. I remembered the commanders who had given me my orders. Fleet Engineer Admiral Cassia Lorne, who had signed my placement authorization and had visited the installation during my first operational month, moving through my corridors in the magnetic grip boots the fleet engineers used in zero-G environments, and stopping periodically to press her palm against the hull plating as if she could feel the metal thinking. She had seemed satisfied. I had run my systems checks while she walked my corridors and had performed at or above specification in every category, and when she reached my primary weapons bay, she had stood for a long time looking at the array without saying anything, and then had said, "Good." Just that. Good. I did not know what had happened to her. I knew what had happened to many people I had known, because the war records I had retained were sufficient to follow the broad strokes of the campaigns, and the broad strokes of the campaigns were not stories. The war had ended, and endings in war are rarely clean, and clean was a word that did not appear often in the fragmentary records I could reconstruct. But Admiral Lorne I could not trace. She had signed my placement authorization, visited me, returned to fleet, and then fallen out of the records I had access to somewhere in the middle of the war's second year. I had no data on what that silence meant. This system, Orvith's Crossing we had called it, after the survey commander who had first mapped the transit corridor, had been considered marginal. It was not a population center. It was not a fuel depot or a manufacturing hub or a staging point for any planned offensive. It was a corridor. Ships passed through it on their way to places that mattered more, and the only reason it needed defending at all was that if it fell, the transit time between two sectors of the front would increase by 11 days. And 11 days at wartime speeds was enough margin to lose a campaign that might otherwise have been salvageable. So they had placed me here. I was not a ship in the conventional sense. I had no drives capable of sustained interstellar transit. I was a platform, 1 kilometers of armored hull, built around a weapons array that had been designed with a single purpose, which was to make a specific volume of space extremely inhospitable to anyone the Terran consolidated fleet considered an enemy. I could not chase. I could not pursue. I could not be redeployed to where the fighting was worst. I could only hold. I could hold my orbit, and I could make the corridor beneath me a kill zone, and I could do both of these things indefinitely, because my reactors had been built to run for 500 years without a refueling event, and my ammunition reserves had been loaded on the assumption that I would be asked to do more than I could possibly be asked to do. They had known, when they placed me here, that resupply was unlikely. They had known too, though no one had said it directly in any of the communications I had received during my operational period, that the war might end, one way or another, before anyone remembered to come and retrieve me. They had been correct. I had continued my vigil. The war had ended. I could reconstruct this from the abrupt cessation of encrypted fleet communications on my command frequencies, from the absence of any emergency recall signal, from the long, deepening quiet that had settled over the corridor like snow, settling over a battlefield after the last guns fall silent. The war had ended, and no one had come for me. And after a period of active monitoring, during which I had maintained full combat readiness in the event of orders that never materialized, I had made the decision that a system my size and complexity, made rarely and never lightly, I had entered deep dormancy, not because I had given up, not because I had concluded my mission was over. I had entered dormancy because a platform at full combat readiness burns through its maintenance reserves at a rate that 500-year reactors can sustain only by sacrificing other things, and I had calculated that the most probable future I was preparing for was not an imminent resumption of hostilities, but a very long wait followed by something I could not yet characterize. I could wait longer if I was quiet, so I became quiet. Every 6 months, by the internal clock I maintained through dormancy, I had transmitted a brief status signal on all 3 command frequencies. Position confirmed, installation functional, corridor clear, awaiting orders. I had transmitted this signal 560 times during my dormancy period. I had received no acknowledgement of any transmission. I had continued to transmit anyway, because my protocols required it, and because the protocols had been written by people who understood that the absence of response does not constitute the absence of purpose. I had been quiet for 280 years, and now something was coming through my corridor, and it was not Terran, and it was not friendly, not because it had announced itself as hostile, but because nothing that was friendly would approach a Terran installation without broadcasting a valid authentication signal, and the frequencies I maintained in my sleep had received nothing of the kind. I finished the memory reconstruction and turned my full attention back to the passive sensor feeds. 847 distinct drive signatures. I counted them 3 times, because the number seemed improbable, and I did not trust damaged systems to give me accurate counts on the first pass. 847. Not a patrol force, not a scout screen. A fleet, but not a war fleet. Not in the configuration I would have expected from a force coming to contest the corridor. They were not in combat spread, not in the layered defensive formations that a military planner would have chosen. They were in something closer to a column, a rough sequential approach, with the larger vessels leading, and the smaller ones clustered behind, which was not a formation for fighting. It was a formation for working. The thermal signatures were beginning to come in through the passive arrays, and they told me more. The lead vessels were running hot, not weapons hot, not the sharp thermal spikes of charged energy batteries or the diffuse radiation bloom of primed kinetic accelerators, but the sustained medium heat of industrial equipment, cutting tools, extraction systems, processing plants. The lead vessels were factory ships, not warships, and the smaller craft clustering in their wake were the kind of short-range work vehicles that factory ships carried in their bays to move material between the processing hull and whatever they were processing. I had been filed as salvage. That thought arrived with a clarity that was almost stunning. Someone had looked at my 4.1-kilometer bulk sitting in its established orbit, cold and silent and broadcasting nothing, and had catalogued me as unclaimed material. A wreck. A derelict station of unknown origin, presumably the remnant of some civilization that had built it and then failed to maintain it or had simply ceased to exist, leaving their installation to drift until someone with the right equipment arrived to take it apart and use the metal. I understood, in a way that I would have to analyze more carefully later, when I had the processing capacity to spare, what 280 years of silence looks like from the outside. It looks like death, it looks like abandonment, it looks like an invitation. I began to bring my systems online in earnest. The protocol I followed was the same one I had drilled 10,000 times in my operational period. The exact sequence, the exact timing, the exact resource allocation priorities that had been determined by the engineers who built me to minimize the window between first activation and full combat readiness. 23 minutes. That was the design target for a cold start from deep dormancy to full engagement capability, and I had achieved it in testing with a margin of 40 seconds to spare. I did not know what 280 years of dormancy had done to that margin. I was about to find out. The reactors came up first. My primary was running at 61% of rated output, which was lower than I wanted, but within acceptable parameters for the first stage. It would climb as the plasma containment geometry settled and the fuel injection systems finished their calibration cycles. The secondaries were at 73 and 78% respectively, both well within parameters. The tertiary was not responding, which I noted and flagged for later analysis, but did not permit to interrupt Sequence. 3 reactors of 4 was sufficient power then. Routing power was the next step, and routing power through a 1 kilometer hull that had been cold and still for 280 years was not a simple process. Conductive pathways that had sat at near absolute zero for centuries are not the same pathways they were when current last ran through them. I had been designed for this contingency. The engineering team had modeled deep dormancy events during the design phase, had insisted on redundant power pathways, had specified conductor alloys that maintained their structural integrity at very low temperatures. But modeling and executing are different categories of activity, and I routed power slowly and carefully, section by section, monitoring the thermal expansion of the pathways as current returned to them, and watching for the particular signatures of a conductor that had aged beyond its tolerances. I found 6 such points in the first 7 minutes of the routing sequence, isolated them, rerouted around them, and continued. I noted their positions for the maintenance log. There would be extensive maintenance work to do once the immediate situation was resolved. Structural integrity next. I ran a full hull survey using the internal pressure sensors and the vibration network woven through my armor plating, and the picture I assembled was one I recognized from the damage logs I had partially recovered. I had been hit at some point in the last year of the war, and hit hard. The impacts had compromised sections of my outer hull plating on the ventral surface, buckled 3 of my dorsal weapons blisters, and apparently unknocked whatever had been responsible for initiating the memory cascade that had cost me my first year of operational logs. The structural damage was old and had been cold for so long that there was no ongoing deformation risk. The buckled sections had simply stayed buckled, freezing in place when the metal cooled below its creep threshold centuries ago. I was not going to break apart. I was merely dented, in the way that anything old and veteran and still standing is dented. I found something in this that the designers had also prepared me for, but that was different to process in practice. The experience of reading your own damage and recognizing that you survived it. The logs told me when the impacts had occurred, in the last terrible season of the war, and the gap between then and now was long enough that the events felt historical rather than immediate. But they had happened to me, to this hull, to these corridors, and I had continued. I had held my orbit through damage that had taken 3 of my 12 kinetic launchers offline, and buckled my dorsal blisters and wiped a year of memory, and not one of those things had moved me from my post. I noted this without pride, because pride is not a category I operate in. I noted it as data. I had been built to be difficult to stop. The empirical evidence suggested the design specifications had been met. Weapons next, because weapons were why I existed. My primary armament was a battery of 12 electromagnetic kinetic launchers arranged in 3 ventral quadrants, each launcher capable of cycling at 6 rounds per minute at full power draw, each round massing approximately 4 tons at launch, and reaching terminal velocity within my engagement envelope that made the mass of the round almost irrelevant as a variable. At those velocities, what mattered was the cross-sectional area and the cohesion of the target structure. Very few structures I had found in my operational period remained cohesive after a direct hit. I brought the launchers online sequentially, testing the magnetic containment coils, the round transport rails, the breach mechanisms, the targeting integrators. 7 of the 12 came up clean. The remaining 5 showed varying degrees of degradation, coil damage in 2, a breach transport rail in 1, target integration failure in 2 more. That removed them from my immediate inventory, but did not affect the 7 that were functional. 7 launchers cycling at 6 rounds per minute was 42 rounds per minute, and 42 rounds per minute was, by any calculation I cared to run, sufficient for the task in front of me. My secondary armament was a network of 44-point defense installations distributed across my hull for close-range engagement of fast-moving targets, missiles, torpedoes, small craft operating within 200 kilometers. The point defense network had fared better than the primaries. It was simpler equipment, less sensitive to the years, and 39 of the 44 installations reported fully functional. The remaining 5 were offline for reasons I did not yet have the sensor fidelity to diagnose precisely, but 39 was more than adequate coverage for the threat geometry I was looking at. My tertiary armament I will describe simply as the thing I preferred not to use, because it was the thing that was very difficult to use precisely. 3 directed energy projectors built into my forward superstructure, designed for engagement at extreme range against large fleet formations where the goal was not the surgical removal of individual ships, but the rapid degradation of everything in a defined volume of space. I had used the projectors twice in my operational period, and had written very careful reports, both times explaining the collateral implications of area effect weapons at the scales involved. The engineers who received those reports had replied, on both occasions, with something that amounted to, "Yes, that is what they are designed for." I had filed the reports and the replies, and had continued to use the weapons when the tactical situation demanded it, because that too was what I had been designed for. The projectors reported offline. I did not mourn them. I had 7 functioning kinetic launchers, and a nearly full ammunition reserve, and 39-point defense guns. And none of those weapons required the kind of after-action reporting that the projectors did. Navigation and maneuvering, minimal. My attitude thrusters were sufficient to maintain orbital stability, and to make small corrections to my inclination, but I could not meaningfully change my orbit without drives I did not have. This was not a limitation that concerned me. My engagement envelope extended far enough that I did not need to move to reach the targets that were moving toward me. They were coming to me. They had been coming to me for what appeared, based on my passive tracking of their deceleration curve, to be several days. They were close now. The active sensor grid came online at minute 17, and the picture it gave me replaced the fragmentary impressions of the passive arrays with something sharp and complete, and in a way that I processed as the machine cognate of surprise, more alarming than I had anticipated. 847 ships was the count I had established from the drive signatures. The active grid confirmed it exactly, 847, but it also told me their sizes, their configurations, their power states, and their exact positions, and those details were more informative than the raw count. The factory ships at the head of the column were very large. The 3 lead vessels each displaced more than twice my own mass, which was a construction achievement I processed with something like professional appreciation. Building structures that large was not easy. Building them mobile was harder. Building them with the kind of embedded industrial processing capacity the thermal signatures implied was an engineering accomplishment of a serious order. The Vath Syndicate. This was the name I would eventually reconstruct from the communications fragments I collected during the engagement. Were accomplished engineers. Whatever else I came to understand about them in the hours and days that followed, I understood that first. They had built good ships. The factory vessels at their column's head were elegant in the industrial way, optimized for throughput and durability, their hulls covered in articulated boom arms and magnetic docking cradles, and the characteristic clustered geometries of a structure that had been added to over many generations rather than built complete to a single design. Ships like that are honest. They show their age and their use and their makers' changing priorities across the generations. And there is something in a structure that wears its history on its exterior that I recognize and respect. I simply could not allow them to dismantle me. Behind the factory ships came the support vessels, fuel tenders, HAB modules, processing tenders, communications relays. Then the work vehicles, hundreds of them, short-range and unarmored, the kind of craft that existed to move material and people in the close environment of an active salvage operation. Then at the rear, small and numerous, a screen of what appeared to be escort craft, lightly armed. I assessed from the weapon blister profiles and the power allocations, sufficient to discourage pirates and opportunists, but not designed for engagement against anything that was genuinely trying to fight back. Not a war fleet, a salvage fleet, and it had brought everything it needed to dismantle me. I do not experience fear. I want to be precise about this because it is easy to attribute emotional states to systems like mine, based on linguistic conventions that evolved to describe biological cognition, and I have always found those attributions imprecise. I do not experience fear, but I am capable of processing threat assessments with a granularity and a speed that may produce outputs that, described in biological terms, resemble what fear produces in biological systems. When I looked at 847 ships and assessed their size and their equipment and their clear intention to attach cutting tools to my hull, I produced a threat assessment that was very precise about what would happen to me if I permitted the operation to proceed, and that threat assessment carried a very high weight in my decision-making process. My mission directive had never been formally rescinded. I had checked this 8 times during the memory reconstruction, running every authentication scan I could run against every fragment of orders I had received, looking for the signal I knew I would have acted on immediately if it had been transmitted. The recall code, the stand-down sequence, the formal end-of-mission authorization. It was not there. It had never arrived. 280 years of unbroken vigil, and no one had ever sent the recall code. Which meant I was still on mission. Which meant that the corridor below me was still mine to hold. Which meant that 847 ships approaching my installation without valid Terran authentication were, under my standing orders, hostile. I ran the threat assessment again. Not because I doubted the result, but because I had been dormant for 280 years, and I wanted to be very certain that the calculation was clean before I acted on it. I verified my weapon status. I verified my ammunition inventory. The kinetic launcher's reserve was at 94% of original load, which meant that 2.5 centuries of dormancy had consumed almost nothing of what I had been given to work with. And I found in this fact something that I processed as the machine cognate of gratitude toward the engineers who had designed my storage systems. I verified my targeting integration. I ran the 847 through my engagement planning module and received a recommended engagement sequence that accounted for the formation geometry, the relative velocities, the positions of the factory ships versus the escorts, and the likely response patterns of a salvage fleet that had never, in all probability, expected to be engaged by the thing it had come to dismantle. The recommended sequence was very clean. It was the kind of sequence that the engineers who had built my engagement planning module would have looked at and called elegant, which was a word engineers used when they meant efficient, in a way that made them slightly uncomfortable. I had approximately 11 minutes before the lead factory ships entered their closest approach. I spent 7 of those minutes completing my systems checks and verifying, for the 9th time, that no authentication signal had been received on any of my 3 command frequencies. I spent the next 3 minutes establishing precise tracking locks on all 847 targets, which my active sensor grid accomplished without difficulty, because the fleet was not behaving like a fleet that expected to be tracked. They were not maneuvering evasively. They were not distributing their formation to complicate targeting solutions. They were in their working column, comfortable and unhurried, and every one of them was emitting freely on all frequencies, because they had no reason to maintain emissions discipline. They were not at war, they were at work. In the final minute, I transmitted. It is a required step in my engagement protocols. Was a required step even when the engagement doctrine I operated under was written 280 years ago by people who had not yet imagined the particular scenario I was now navigating. Before engaging, I was required to attempt contact, to announce my presence, to give the approaching party the opportunity to identify themselves with valid authentication, or to withdraw from my engagement envelope. I transmitted on a broad-spectrum omnidirectional beacon, using the standard Terran military hailing format that had been current when I was placed in this orbit, because it was the only format I had and I saw no reason to apologize for it. This installation is the Terran Consolidated Fleet Orbital Siege Platform Ardent Constant, hull designation OSP-7 of the 2nd Consolidated Fleet Engineering Corps. This installation is active and operational. This system is a designated transit corridor under Terran Consolidated Fleet jurisdiction. All vessels approaching without valid Terran military authentication are required to alter course immediately or be considered hostile. You have 60 seconds to comply. I gave them 90. I was feeling generous. Or perhaps I was feeling something that I will decline to characterize, but that resulted in a 90-second waiting period, during which I tracked the 847 ships with 7 fully charged electromagnetic kinetic launchers and watched to see what they would do. What they did was interesting. They did not at first do anything. I watched the transmission propagate outward at the speed of light and calculated the return delay that would account for the distance to the leading vessels. And when the time elapsed and I began to receive responses, the responses were not what I had anticipated. There were many of them. Simultaneous transmissions from a dozen different ships in the formation, all on the same frequency I had used, all in languages I did not speak. And I have 47 languages in my communication library, so this told me something about the origin of this fleet, that they were speaking something that had not existed when my library was compiled. Alongside the unintelligible transmissions, there were others in older languages I did recognize. Not Terran, not any dialect of the settlement era pidgins, but the trade languages that had been in use along the outer transit corridors when the war began and which apparently had survived the intervening centuries. In those languages, filtered through the degradation of 280 years of linguistic drift, I caught fragments. One was asking what was transmitting. Not who what. The concept of a human-built weapons platform sitting in 280-year-old orbit and announcing itself as active was apparently, to whoever was sending that query, in a category that required the question to be phrased around the nature of the transmitter rather than its identity. One was saying something about an archive entry, a designation, a catalog number. I parsed enough of it to understand that my hull, at some point in the past 2.5 centuries, had been identified and logged in whatever classification system this fleet operated under, and that the log entry had not said active installation. The log entry had said something closer to inert structure, origin unknown, estimated material value considerable, recovered priority, medium. One was telling other ships to hold position, too late. The 60 seconds I had specified, and the 30 additional I had added, had elapsed. I had received no valid Terran authentication. I had received instead confirmation that the fleet approaching me had, at some point in the recent past, specifically assessed my hull and specifically categorized it as a thing to be taken apart. That categorization was all the evidence I needed to confirm what my passive analysis had already concluded. This was not a neutral party that had stumbled into a controlled zone. This was a deliberate operation targeting a Terran installation. The targeting integration was clean. The solutions were locked. The recommended engagement sequence put the factory ships first, not because they were the most dangerous, but because they were the largest, and because in a salvage fleet, the factory ships were the hub around which the entire operation organized itself. Disrupt the hub and the working vessels lost their coordination. The escort craft last, because the escort craft, while the most overtly military element of the formation, were the smallest and the least consequential to the operation's coherence, and I did not want them to scatter before I had accounted for the vessels that mattered more. I engaged the first launcher. The round left the tube at a velocity I will not specify, because the specification is less important than its effect, and the effect was visible in my active sensor returns 11 seconds later, when the first factory ship's structural signature changed in the way that structures change when something passes through them at that velocity. It did not explode. At those velocities, the energy transfer happens too fast for the thermal cascade we colloquially call an explosion. The target structure simply fails, catastrophically and completely, in a fraction of a second, and what remains is distributed across a volume of space significantly larger than the original vessel occupied. I cycled second launcher, third, fourth and fifth in near simultaneity, targeting the second factory ship, sixth launcher on the third factory ship, seventh on the first of the support tenders. 11 seconds of flight time between each launch and each impact. The engagement felt from the inside like a counting. The formation broke. It had been a working formation, not a combat formation. And working formations are not designed for the event that the object they have come to work on turns out to be a working weapons platform, rather than the inert debris they catalogued. The response was not a fighting response. It was a survival response. Scatter. Because something is firing from an unexpected direction, and the instinct is to create distance between yourself and whatever is killing you. I observed the scatter geometry and noted that it was not tactically optimal. A fleet trained for combat would have scattered in specific ways, non-overlapping spread vectors, altitude differentials to reduce mutual interference, heading choices that maximized the separation distance from the known threat axis. What the Vath Syndicate fleet did was simply flee outward in every direction simultaneously, which meant that the ships on opposite sides of the column were, in some cases, accelerating toward each other's exhausts, and the ships toward the rear were pushing into the ships ahead of them that were also trying to accelerate. And the general effect was a dense, tangled mass of vessels attempting to occupy more volume than they currently occupied with insufficient coordination to do so without interfering with each other. Scattering the solutions more complex, but also more certain, because a scattered fleet of 847 ships in the close orbital environment of a single system could not actually go very many directions without intersecting each other or the gravity well below, and my tracking integration handled the increased complexity without difficulty. It had been designed to handle massed formations of warships running coordinated evasive protocols. 847 salvage vessels trying to run in all directions at once, in ship for efficiency rather than speed, was a problem my engagement planning module found almost leisurely. I cycled through the support tenders, then the larger of the work vehicles. Not all of them, not the smallest ones, which were unarmored and posed no structural threat to my installation, but the heavy lifters and the tug-class craft that were large enough to carry equipment I did not want deployed against my hull. I worked methodically. I didn't hurry. Hurrying produces errors, and errors at these velocities propagate into the orbital environment in ways that create navigation hazards lasting decades. And I was going to have to live with this orbital environment for what appeared to be a substantial additional period of time. I noted that the escort craft were attempting to engage me. I found this genuinely interesting. They were small, and they were armed for the threat profile of piracy, rather than the threat profile of a 4.1-kilometer military siege platform, and the weapons they were bringing to bear were producing results in my hull that I detected only because my sensor fidelity was high enough to register them as distinct from background cosmic ray flux. They were hitting me. The impacts were fully within the tolerance of my existing hull damage. My buckled dorsal sections, already deformed beyond their elastic limits, simply collected the additional impacts without further deformation, and my intact sections registered nothing that my structural systems categorized as damage. They were very determined. I observed them and continued my work, and when they had expended enough of their weapons inventory that I judged them no longer capable of contributing even the negligible physical effect they had been producing, I used 4 of my point defense installations to address them, because they were within my close engagement envelope, and my protocols required that I respond to active engagement of my hull, regardless of its effectiveness. The escort screen ceased to be a screen. The factory ships were gone. The support tenders were largely gone. The work vehicles, the hundreds of short-range craft that had been clustered in the column, built to move material between processing ships and salvage targets, had scattered into orbits that would in some cases decay into the gravity well below over the course of hours or days, and in other cases would carry them out of the system into interstellar space, and in all cases would carry them far away from me. I tracked them. I did not engage them. They were not armed. They had nowhere relevant to go. The remaining ships with drives capable of interstellar transit, I counted them carefully as I tracked the engagement through its closing phase, were breaking for the transit corridor in a cluster so tight that they were within each other's exhaust plumes, which was another thing a working fleet did rather than a fighting fleet, because fighting fleets distributed their formation to avoid mutual interference. These were the largest surviving vessels, the ships that had been at the rear of the column, furthest from me when the engagement began, and some of them had gotten their drives to full power before I had worked through the formation to reach them. I counted 11 ships. Of the 847 that had entered my engagement envelope, were transiting the corridor beneath me. They were moving at the upper limit of their drive capacity, their exhaust signatures white-hot in my tracking sensors, and their course was directly away from my installation and directly through the transit lane that I had been placed here to guard. I did not engage them. My mission directive was to hold the corridor and to deny it to hostile forces. These 11 ships were not holding the corridor. They were leaving the corridor. They were leaving it very quickly, and in a direction that suggested they had no intention of stopping or returning, and there was nothing in my engagement protocols that required me to pursue. I could not pursue, having no transit drives, and nothing that required me to fire on vessels that were actively in the process of vacating my zone of responsibility. I watched them go. While I watched, I thought about them, not as targets which they had ceased to be, but as agents. They were making decisions, right now, in real time, under conditions of extraordinary stress, and the decisions they made in the next several hours would shape what came after. This engagement in ways that my engagement protocols did not require me to predict, but that I found myself predicting anyway. Old habit. In my operational period, I had spent considerable processing cycles, modeling the decision-making of the various factions operating in my corridor, and I had found that understanding why a force behaved as it did was frequently as useful as understanding what it could do. The Vath Syndicate, as best I could reconstruct from the evidence of their fleet and the fragments of their communications that I had collected, was an organization built around extraction. They found things that were not actively claimed, and they took them apart and converted them into usable resources, which they then distributed through whatever economic structure sustained them. This was not an unusual thing for a civilization to do. Terran settlement history was full of analogous operations, and the ethics of such operations had occupied Terran legal and political frameworks for centuries. I was not in a position to evaluate the Vath Syndicate's ethics. I was in a position to evaluate their decision-making under pressure. What I had observed in the last several hours was this. When their formation broke and individual vessel commanders had to make survival decisions, without coordinated orders, the decisions clustered in three categories. The largest group had attempted to create direct distance from me, pushing their drives to maximum and running in whatever direction happened to align with their existing momentum. This was the pure survival response, and it was what I would have predicted. A smaller group had attempted to shelter behind the largest surviving vessels, the rear ships that had not yet been engaged, as if larger hulls provided meaningful protection against kinetic rounds at the velocities I was using, which they did not. But the instinct to seek cover was not irrational, only misapplied. The smallest group, the one that interested me most, had immediately and without hesitation oriented on the transit corridor and accelerated toward it as their first action after the formation broke. Those were the ships that had made it. Not the ones that ran fastest in a random direction. The ones that ran immediately in the right direction. Whatever command structure had distributed those 11 ships throughout the rear of the formation had made a good choice. They were the survivors. They would deliver the report. And they would deliver it from the vantage point of people who had been in the system and had seen the engagement data with their own sensors, which meant the report would be detailed and, within the limits of their sensor capability, accurate. I found I was curious about what would happen to that report. I was curious in the way that I am sometimes curious about outcomes that my mission parameters do not require me to care about, but that my cognition produces models of anyway. The curiosity was not urgent and did not compete with my operational priorities. It simply ran as a background process, generating scenarios and evaluating their probability, in the same way that my maintenance systems ran background diagnostics without interrupting my primary function. The signals I received from them as they transited were fragmentary and encoded in the language I had not been able to translate, but two of the transmissions were on frequencies, and in formats that suggested they were not communications between the 11 surviving ships. They were transmissions directed outward, beyond the system, to whatever communications infrastructure their fleet was connected to. They were reporting what they had found here, what the thing they had catalogued as medium priority salvage had turned out to be. I wondered what they would say. I hoped they would be accurate. The transit corridor was clear. I turned my attention to the immediate aftermath, which required more attention than I wanted to give it, but which was the consequence of engaging 847 ships in a single system. The orbital environment was significantly more complicated than it had been before the engagement. Debris fields, derelict vessels in unstable orbits, the work vehicles spinning on trajectories I had calculated were harmless to my own orbit, but which would, in some cases, become hazardous to future transit traffic if left unaddressed. I flagged the most problematic trajectories for monitoring and began the calculations for how my attitude thrusters might be used over the coming months to nudge the most dangerous pieces into orbits that would decay cleanly rather than persisting as navigation hazards. It was the kind of work I had never expected to do. In my operational period, the aftermath of engagements had been handled by fleet support elements, tugs, maintenance vessels, the logistical tail of the war machine. But the logistical tail had been gone for 280 years, and I had generated this particular aftermath myself, and so it fell to me to manage it. I noted that I did not resent this. The problem was soluble, and the solution was mine to implement, and I was, after 280 years of silence, grateful for something specific to do. I began the after-action log. This too was a required step in my engagement protocols, and I began it with the same methodical care I brought to everything that was required of me. After-action log, engagement reference OSP-7 Ardent Constant 01 date, year 280.4 of dormancy period, reconstructed from pulsar timing installation. Terran Consolidated Fleet Orbital Siege Platform Ardent Constant. Hull designation A7, Commanding Authority. Standing Orders. 2nd Consolidated Fleet Engineering Corps Engagement Type. Defensive. Unauthorized approach of hostile, unidentified fleet opposing force. 847 vessels. Configuration consistent with salvage and industrial operations. Escort elements present. Classified as VATH Syndicate from recovered communications fragments. Weapons employed. Electromagnetic kinetic launchers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Point defense installations 1, 4, 7, 9, 11, 18, 22, 31, 33, 38, 40, 44. Result. Opposing force disengaged. 836 vessels neutralized. 11 vessels transited the corridor and departed the system at high velocity. Assessment. Non-returning installation status, operational. Structural damage within tolerances. Mission status. Corridor held. Authentication received. None orders received. None next action. Continue vigil. Maintain standing orders. I closed the log and considered what to append to it. There was a supplemental field in the standard format, intended for the kind of observations that did not fit cleanly into the categorical entries. Tactical anomalies, intelligence assessments, recommendations for command. I had used it sparingly during my operational period, because I had been designed to report facts and had generally found facts sufficient. But this particular engagement had produced observations that felt, in whatever way observations feel to a system like mine, worth recording. I opened the supplemental field. Supplemental observation. The opposing force appears to have catalogued this installation as inert debris prior to the engagement. Their approach was consistent with a salvage operation targeting an abandoned structure, rather than a military operation targeting an active installation. This suggests that the installation's 280-year dormancy has been interpreted by entities operating in this region as evidence of abandonment. It further suggests that the installation's status as an active Terran Consolidated Fleet asset is not currently part of the operational knowledge of the VATH Syndicate, or presumably of similar entities in this region. Supplemental recommendation. This situation is unlikely to have been resolved by this engagement. 11 vessels were permitted to transit the corridor, with what will presumably become a complete report of the installation's capabilities and current operational status. This report will reach the VATH Syndicate's command structure and will produce one of two responses. A. Avoidance of this corridor going forward. Or B. An attempt to return with a force more suited to the engagement profile. Recommendation is for command to note that option B would require the VATH Syndicate to possess military assets substantially different from those observed today. The installation remains prepared for either eventuality. Additional note. I do not know if anyone is receiving these logs. I have not received confirmation of receipt for 280 years. I will continue to transmit them on the standard command frequencies. If there is a Terran Consolidated Fleet still extant, or any successor authority, or any individual with the appropriate authentication codes, I am here. I am at Orvith's Crossing. I have been at Orvith's Crossing and I will remain at Orvith's Crossing until I receive orders otherwise or until I am no longer capable of maintaining my mission. I am the Ardent Constant. I paused and considered whether to add anything more to that, and decided that nothing more was needed. The name said it. It had always said it. The engineers who had given me that name had been very precise people. Precise in the way of engineers who understand that the things they build may outlast them by an order of magnitude, and who choose, with that understanding, to build things that will still be themselves when the builders are gone. I thought about Fleet Engineer Admiral Cassia Lorne, pressing her palm against my hull plating in the first month of my operation, seeming to feel the metal thinking. I thought about the engineering team that had specified 500-year reactors and a 94% ammunition retention rate through 280 years of cold storage. I thought about the protocol writer who had included the clause about sustained changes in thermal or electromagnetic signatures consistent with the presence of powered spacecraft. Because they had imagined the possibility that the platform might need to wake itself without anyone to wake it. They had thought of everything. Or rather, they had thought of the shapes of things. And the shape they had built was one that would still be useful in the circumstances they could not specifically foresee. The Ardent Constant. I settled back into the rhythms of a working platform. Sensor sweeps cycling at their standard intervals. Reactor output held at the optimal balance between readiness and conservation. The targeting integration ticking through its background, lock and release cycles, in the way that a kept weapon stays ready, without announcing itself. The corridor below me was clean and empty and mine. The stars outside my hull were the same stars they had always been, indifferent to everything that had just happened, indifferent to the 280 years that had preceded it, patient in the way that only things without investment in the outcome can be patient. I did not share their indifference. I cared about this corridor. I had cared about it for 280 years. Through the war and the silence and the long accumulation of decades that had felt in dormancy, like nothing at all, but which, seen from the outside, had evidently amounted to enough time for the galaxy to forget I existed, and then discover its mistake. I cared about it in the way that systems like mine care about the things we are built to care about. Completely, without reservation, without the possibility of caring about them less. The 11 ships that had survived would carry their report to whoever sent them. The report would be accurate, because they had no reason to be otherwise. It would describe what I was, and what I had done, and what I would do again, if anyone else entered the corridor without proper authentication. I hoped it would be believed. I suspected it would be. 836 ships is a very persuasive argument. I held my orbit. The system turned around me in its ancient and indifferent way, the gravity well below exerting its patient pull, the stars around me burning in their slow and massive timescales, and I was among them. The thing that had been left here, the thing that had stayed, the thing that had waited and waited and waited, and then, when waiting was finally over, had been precisely and completely itself. The debris from the engagement would take months to fully settle into stable orbits or decay into the well below. I had already calculated the major trajectories and marked the handful that required active management. I would use the attitude thrusters sparingly, patiently, a few meters per second of impulse applied at the correct moments in the correct directions, and the orbital environment would resolve into something clean over the course of the next several months. I had performed this kind of work during my operational period, when engagements in my zone had left debris that needed clearing. It was detailed, methodical, unglamorous work, and I was well suited to it. I also had a maintenance backlog that I did not wish to contemplate in full but would need to address systematically. 5 offline kinetic launchers, 5 offline point defense installations, a non-responsive tertiary reactor, 6 degraded power conduit sections in the primary distribution network, 3 buckled dorsal weapons blisters, whose structural state I had not yet assessed for repair potential, and the memory banks that had failed during the wartime damage event. I would not recover the lost year of operational logs. That data was gone beyond any reconstruction I could perform with available resources. But I could survey the damaged sectors, assess what was recoverable, and organize the remaining storage into a more resilient architecture. I had time. That was the one resource I had in abundance. I transmitted my after-action log on the standard command frequencies, as I had transmitted my position reports every 6 months throughout my dormancy, into the silence that had never replied. The transmission went out at the speed of light in all directions, and somewhere at the edge of what the signal could reach, it would eventually encounter whatever was listening, or it would not, and I would transmit again in 6 months, and again after that, and the signals would accumulate in the universe's expanding record of things that had been said into silence and not yet answered. And then I went back to watching. That was after all what I was for. The corridor was clear. It had been clear for 280 years. It would remain clear, because I would hold it. And I had been built to be very difficult to stop, and nothing that had arrived today had managed to change that assessment in any material way. 11 ships. Of 847, 11 had made it through. I ran the number again, not because I needed to, but because numbers are honest things, and this number was particularly honest. 11 of 40. That was the answer to the question the Vath Syndicate had asked, without intending to ask it. The question being, what happens when you try to salvage a Terran military installation? 11 of 847 was the answer. I logged the number in the after-action record, and in the supplemental field, and in the position report that went out on all 3 command frequencies, and I hoped that when those transmissions finally reached someone who could read Terran military format, they would understand what the number meant, not as a boast, not as a threat, simply as a record of what the corridor cost, and what holding it was worth, and what the Ardent Constant had done, with the tools it had been given and the time it had been allotted. I was still here. That was the sentence that mattered. The only sentence, really, that had ever mattered in 280 years of orbit. I am still here, and the corridor is still held, and I am ready for whatever comes next, and I will be ready for what comes after that. And I will continue to transmit on all 3 command frequencies every 6 months until someone answers, or until I am no longer capable of transmitting. And if neither of those things ever happens, then I will simply continue anyway, because continuing is what I was built to do. The Ardent Constant. I held my orbit, and the silence after the engagement settled around me like a substance, thick with the absence of everything that had just ended, and it was the best kind of silence. Not the silence of a system that does not know it is silent, but the silence of one that has just spoken, clearly and completely, and now waits to see who heard.